He has authored over 20 books, produced many DVDs, and you can learn more about William Federer online at www.americanminute.com. But if you are already familiar with him, then you know that relatively few people possess his breadth of knowledge and fluency with that knowledge. Again, it's amazing that we have William Federer with us tonight. Would you please give a warm Rapid City welcome to William Federer?
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Now, most people of Muslim background just want to live their lives, have their families, and they're content to coexist with non-Muslims. I'm going to share a little recent history and then a little ancient history. And so the recent history is the Ottoman Turkish Empire began after the Turks conquered the Byzantine Christian Empire. And so this is what the Ottoman Turks controlled. All of North Africa, which used to be Christian, there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa. St. Augustine of Hippo was from Carthage, today that's Tunisia. Egypt used to be Christian, evangelized by Mark, that wrote the Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? Until the Caliph Amir ibn al-As conquered Egypt. Syria used to be completely Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul. Antioch, Syria is where the name Christian was first used until Caliph Umar conquered it. Turkey used to be the Byzantine Christian Empire. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation, Ephesus, Thyatira, Sardis, all those were in Asia Minor, and they were conquered by the Muslim Turks. And all the letters in the New Testament written to Ephesus and Colossae and Galatia and Philippi, all those cities mentioned in the New Testament were wiped out by the Muslim Turks. And then they conquered Constantinople, and then they conquered into Eastern Europe and surrounded Vienna. This is called the Ottoman Empire. It went through 3 stages. An expanding stage from 1299 to 1683, a maintaining stage from 1683 to 1828, and then a collapsing stage from 1828 to 1923. And so this is where we're going to pick up. And so the Ottoman Empire at its peak in 1683 controlled this enormous area. But then they lost the Battle of Vienna, and they began to shrink, until finally, after World War I, the Ottoman Empire was gone. And so, toward the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, France took a part of the old Ottoman Empire, parts of Algiers and Morocco, and a little bit of Tunisia, and Britain took a part of the old Ottoman Empire, Egypt and Sudan and southern Oman states, and then Russia took a little bit of the Persian area, and then Turkey was left with this area. And so it's still declining, and what happens is that countries want to break away. So Greece breaks away from the Ottoman Empire. Albania breaks away. Romania breaks away. Bulgaria breaks away. Armenia tried to, and they were stopped. But the Sultan, Abdul Hamid, tried to crack down on these groups that are trying to break away. So this is Abdul Hamid, and he butchers 100,000 Armenians in 1896. And it's just a horrible massacre. And then after him, you have the Young Turks, and they kill 1.5 million Armenians between 1915 and 1922. But the Ottoman Empire is collapsing. And if it would have continued in that line, it would have collapsed on its own. But now we're going to add into the picture another ingredient, oil. So in the 1800s, oil came from whale blubber. Whale oil blubber, and you had whaling ships that went around the world to catch and kill whales. The whales were going extinct until they were saved by oil coming out of the ground in Pennsylvania, and then Oklahoma, and then Baghdad. So in the late 1800s, the world is transitioning to steamboats and railroads, and they need oil. And when Europe begins to industrialize, Europe needs oil. And so that's when Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany builds a railroad from Germany across Eastern Europe, across Turkey to Baghdad. And then when World War I starts, Germany is fighting Britain. And you know how the European trench warfare had poison gas. My grandfather fought in World War I, and we had his old gas mask, right? Well, guess what? When the British were invading into Baghdad, they used poison gas. So here we have the poison gas used over there, but it was the British that used it. Anyway, when Germany lost World War I, the Ottoman Empire lost. And so the European powers, this is that railroad again, the European powers decided to divvy up the old Ottoman Empire. And so if it had not been for oil discovered, the Ottoman Empire would have collapsed on its own, but this oil brings these European powers into the Middle East. And so they sat around and they began to divide up the Ottoman Empire. And France took Lebanon and Syria. Britain takes Palestine, Iraq, they have Egypt, and they wanted America to take Armenia, a little area, but Turkey rallies and keeps it, and they can get the Republic of Turkey. Well, one of the interesting aspects at this time was Arabia was not Saudi Arabia yet, it was just plain Arabia. And it was ruled by a leader named Hussein ibn Ali al-Hashimi. We'll just shorten that to al-Hashimi. And he helps the British to defeat the Ottoman Turkish Muslims. And we know the story of Lawrence of Arabia, right? He's T.E. Lawrence is a lieutenant for the British. He's just supposed to check out and report back if the Arabs are capable of helping the British to defeat the Ottoman Turks. Well, he doesn't just check it out. He promises these Arabs that if they help to overthrow the Ottoman Turks, they can have this land. And so these European powers that are drawing up the maps and divvying up the power, they're like, who authorized this guy to give away this land that we're divvying up? So there's a dual claim on the area of the Middle East, where the European powers said, hey, we get it, and these Arabs say, T.E. Lawrence promised us that we get it. So anyway, there's the movie Lawrence of Arabia. He was, by all accounts, a sort of strange, eclectic type person. Anyway, so here's Hussein ibn Ali al-Hashim. He helped the British defeat the Ottomans. His son, Abdullah, is recognized by the British as the King of Jordan. Al-Hashimi's son, Fazl, is recognized by the British as the King of Syria and Iraq. And so, what's their attitude? Well, they sort of like the British. And this King Fazl goes to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and listen to what he says. We feel that the Arabs and the Jews are cousins, in having suffered similar oppressions at the hands of powers stronger than themselves. We look with deepest sympathy on the Zionist movement. We will wish the Jews a most hearty welcome home. Do you believe it? Here you have this Arab Muslim, and he is friends with the British, and he's welcoming the Jews back to Palestine. Well, there's the Abdul, and he, a son of the Al-Hashimi, here he is meeting with Winston Churchill. And then Abdul, king of Jordan, a son of Al-Hashimi, he's meeting with Ataturk. Now, who was Ataturk? After all the bloodshed in Turkey of killing the Armenians and so forth, they get a leader named Ataturk. And what does he want to do? He wants to have a secular government. You see, after World War I, the Muslim Arab world had a bunch of desert, mountains of sand, camels, and the West, England and America and France, they have airplanes and telephones and automobiles. And the West is the future. And so these leaders of these Muslim countries that were created after the Ottoman Empire fell, they wanted to be friends with the West. And so they would dress in Western clothes. They would get rid of the beards and the fezzes and the burqas. And Ataturk got rid of the Arabic language. He wanted the Turkish language. And he invented surnames. So you know Al means of, and Ibn means son of, and Abu means father of, and you'd have these long names. Muhammad ibn Ali Abu Soko. Well, he shortens it, and Ataturk invented last names for the people that live in Turkey. Right? So all of you have last names. Well, he's the one that invented last names for the people in Turkey. And so he actually gave himself the name Ataturk, which means father of Turkey. And he wanted to secularize the government and be friends with the West. That's where the future is. He said this: he is a weak ruler who needs religion to uphold his government. Here he says, even before accepting the religion of the Arabs, the Turks were a great nation. Ataturk says, Mohammedanism was based on Arab nationalism above all nationalities. He says the purpose of the religion founded by Muhammad over all other nations was to drag them into the Arab national politics. He says it may have suited tribes in the desert. It is no good for a modern progressive state. So do you believe this? Here we have the king of Syria and Iraq welcoming the Jews back. His brother, king of Jordan, was friends with Winston Churchill. And here's Ataturk saying, hey, I want a secular government, and we don't need this religion founded by Muhammad. It's no good for a modern progressive state. Now, Ataturk realized that it was when the fundamental Muslims had gotten control of the state that they did the atrocities toward these minorities. And so he put the military in charge of making sure the government in Turkey would never get fundamentalist Muslim again. And it worked until our current guy, Erdogan, got elected. Well, we're talking about secular leaders, and here's the Shah of Iran, Persia, Iran. And he's meeting with Eisenhower, and he's meeting with Truman, and he's meeting with John F. Kennedy. And here he is with his wife meeting with John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy. And so the wives of these leaders are looking like Hollywood movie stars. Here's the Shah of Iran and his wife, and then here is President Herbert Hoover meeting with King Fuad of Egypt. And then you have Nasser is the leader of Egypt. Here he is. He doesn't have a beard. He's not wearing any type of Islamic dress. He's dressing Western. And here's his wife and daughters. And Egypt in the 1960s under Nasser, it looks like the Beach Boys in Southern California. And so the Muslim world is moving in a Western direction. And so here is Nasser's Egypt in the 1970s. That looks like the streets in New York. And this is Iran in the 1970s. I mean, here they are dancing like they were doing in America. This is 1970s Iran, right? So we see what happened. How did we go from this, which looks very much like the West, to this, what we have today? What happened? Well, al-Hashimi, remember him? He helped the British overthrow the Ottomans. Well, he ends up losing control of Arabia to the Sauds and the Wahhabs. What's that? Okay, the Saud was a family that would raid in the desert and attack villages and tents and so forth. But the Wahhab, they were the violent fundamentalist Muslims who would chop off arms and legs. They were this rabid desert type of group. Well, they team up, the Sauds and the Wahhabs, and they conquer Mecca and capture it in the year 1924. Now, why is that significant? Mecca is where the Hajj is, the pilgrimage. So faithful Muslims, once in their life, make a pilgrimage to Mecca. And now that the Wahhabis and the Sauds control Mecca, these Muslims making pilgrimages come and get infected with this Wahhabi version of Islam. Not the al-Hashimi want to be friends with the British version of Islam. It's more of the fundamental version. And it's like a Bible conference and you get to choose who the speakers are going to be. Now all the speakers in Mecca are these imams that are Wahhabi related. So what happened? So two things changed this pro-Western movement in the Muslim world to a fundamentalist movement. So one was the Sauds and the Wahhabs, they spread this fundamental Islam to pilgrims coming to Mecca. 2, oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia in 1938 by Standard Oil Company. So now, Saudis and the Wahhabs control all of Arabia. And al-Hashimi is out, though his sons stayed the king of Syria and Iraq and Jordan. So Saudi Arabia goes from the poorest Muslim country with mountains of useless sand to the richest Muslim country. And it becomes a magnet for the entire Muslim world to be drawn toward this fundamentalist version of Islam. So if you've ever seen those little experiments where you got a battery and a wire around a nail, you got some little metal filings. And when you hook the electricity up, the little metal filings are drawn to point toward that magnet, right? Well, when America began to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, and it became the richest Muslim country, it became a magnet for the Muslim world to say, why should we be more secular, like the West, to be blessed? Let's be more fundamentalist Muslim, like Saudi Arabia and the Wahhabis, to be blessed. And then something else happened. What did Saudi Arabia do with its newfound wealth? Buy politicians in Western countries who want money, right? It takes money to get elected, and so you sort of want to be friends with people that have a lot of money, and the Sauds have it. So here is oil discovered in Saudi Arabia, and they go from this to this. Gold Cadillacs and gold sports cars. This is Riyadh, Saudi Arabia today. And so this is this magnet drawing the Muslim world and influencing politicians. Another thing that changed was Jimmy Carter went from having America be friends with the Shah of Iran. I met the Shah's son. He loved America. He wanted a secular state in Iran. I went to college with some Iranian students, and one of them had an American flag on their dorm room wall. I hate to admit it, but in college, I did not even have an American flag on my dorm room wall. This Iranian student did. And so Iran was pro-West until Jimmy Carter betrayed the Shah and allowed the Ayatollah Khomeini to come in. Why did he do it? The thought is that Russia was making inroads into Iran. His national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, said, well, let's let Iran fall to the fundamentalist Muslims rather than fall to the Soviets. Well, they may have thought it solved the problem, but it created something worse. And so here's Jimmy Carter supporting all these fundamentalist Muslims, and that helped change the situation. Now, we're talking oil. Remember back, the Germans built a railroad to get oil from Baghdad? And now oil is discovered in Saudi Arabia, and the politics are shifting toward them. Well, this is a current news article, and it says Syrian civil war, Saudi Arabia and Turkey's pipeline wars. Qatar, which is a country near Saudi Arabia, Turkey gas pipeline through Syria's Aleppo. Writing in Armed Forces Journal, Major Rob Taylor joined numerous other pundits in observing that the Syrian civil war is actually a pipeline war over control of energy supply, with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey needing to remove Assad so they can control Syria and run their own pipeline through Turkey. So here is Qatar, and there's Saudi Arabia, and here is Syria, and here is Turkey, and there's Europe. So Saudi Arabia wants this oil pipeline to Europe. The problem is, oil and gas to Europe is Russia's #1 export. If this pipeline goes through, Russia is bankrupt. So Russia does not want to let this happen. But Saudi Arabia wants it to happen. And so they buy politicians, and in 2013, the Saudis felt like they needed to have an incident that could be an excuse for America to come in war on their side to oust Assad. And so there's some Syrian Christian minorities that were gassed. Now, there was no motivation for for Assad to gas these minorities that had been there for centuries. Matter of fact, under his protection, they had existed. But once that happens, John Kerry, Secretary of State, says, we want a little war against Syria. We're just going to fire a couple missiles, right? And Obama and Susan Rice and all the rest. Why? Because they want to have this pipeline. But I met Mike Flynn, and he was understanding the Muslim threat, but then he got ousted, and now we basically have the same people in there that Obama had in there wanting to get rid of Assad. Why? So they can finish this pipeline. Well, Wahhabi influence, backed by Saudi oil, reawakened and exported Islamic fundamentalism. So the Wahhabi stuff was just violence that was going on in the desert, but with the Saudi oil, this Wahhabi is spreading. And there's different groups with different names, but they all basically want the same thing. They want to reestablish the Ottoman Empire. They want a caliphate. What is a caliphate? The supreme leader after Muhammad died is called the caliph. The area he controls is the caliphate. And so they want this. And it's an ISIS, it's an Islamic state. And so this Islamic fundamentalism, the majority of Muslims are nonviolent. They just want to live their lives, they want to have their families, and they have no problem living next to kafir infidels. But there's a small minority of Muslims who have reawakened to the fundamentalism, and they commit terrorist attacks. We call this getting radicalized. So this small minority who are radicalized do Boston bombings, Ohio State killings, beheadings in Oklahoma, Fort Hood shooting, San Bernardino killings, Orlando gay killings at gay clubs, and surprise, surprise, a mall shooter was a Muslim in Burlington, Washington, Istanbul airport bombings, Paris attacks. This is Nigeria. The Boko Haram Muslims surround Christian villages and they start shooting their guns, and the people leave their little huts and they get in the middle of town and they're all mowed down and then burnt to death. And these was Kenya mall killings. And LA Times had a documentary called Saving Face, puts the plight on 150 acid attacks on Pakistani women every year. Guess what? Last year, there were 400 acid attacks in London. Right? Most of them are brush-off marriage proposals. So a Muslim man will propose to a woman. If the woman rejects his proposal, he is offended, and he throws acid in her face. If you're not going to marry me, you're not going to marry anybody. And so they've over 1,500 acid attacks in the last number of years in England. And then wherever they move in, they practice female genital mutilation. And on little girls, this is just a week or two ago in Detroit. Here is FBI arrest Muslims during this female genital mutilation claim. Who can think of anything more evil than this? And then these are churches that are being destroyed in Iraq, Iran, Egypt, Middle East, Kenya, Nigeria. These churches have existed for centuries and in many cases thousands of years. And they're destroyed while we're living our lives over here. Iraq's oldest monastery. Just a couple weeks ago, the Coptic Christians in Egypt were bombed and killed. And the grave of Jonah, it existed, right? Jonah in the Bible. His grave existed from 700 BC up until a couple years ago when the ISIS Muslims destroyed him. And now, politicians assure us that these Muslim terrorists do not represent true Islam. Right? The majority of Muslims are nonviolent, they just want to live their lives and their families. But these fundamentalist Muslims, they are yelling Allahu Akbar, and they claim that they do represent true Islam. So the question is, who can tell us what true Islam is? One person, Muhammad. Muhammad was the best Muslim that ever lived. His life is called the Sunnah, which means the way or the example. And so Muhammad's life went through 3 stages. Why is it important to know this? Because the fundamental Muslims want to copy him. The large number of non-violent Muslims just want to live their lives, and they're content to be more secular in the government aspects, but the fundamental ones want to be like Muhammad. So Muhammad's life went through three stages. He was a religious leader, then a political leader, then a military leader. We're going to go through these quickly. And so this is the world 20 years before Muhammad was born. It is the Byzantine Christian Empire. Remember, I talked about North Africa being Christian, Egypt Christian, Syria Christian, Turkey Christian, and so forth. And so for 3 centuries, the Romans persecuted Christians, and then the Roman Emperor Constantine converts. The Roman Empire becomes Christian, and it's Christian for a couple centuries until the Persians attack in 610 AD. Now, at this time, the Persians are mostly pagan. They're Zoroastrian pagan. And so they attack the Byzantines, and they beat each other up and leave a power vacuum. And into that power vacuum comes Islam. So Muhammad, he was born in 570 AD. His father dies before he's born. His mother dies when he is 6 years old. His grandfather and guardian dies when he's 8 years old. So he's orphaned and taken in by an uncle, Abu Talib. And so Abu Talib is a merchant who takes Muhammad with him on camel rides. And Muhammad is exposed to different cities and different religions, and he begins to learn about them. And so, pagan, in Arabia, they had 360 different pagan gods. They were mostly Canaanite fertility gods associated with the sun, the moon, Baal, Ashtaroth. And the most popular god in each town was the Allah for that town. And so Mecca was a big city, and the Allah for Mecca was Hubal, the moon god. And their calendar began with the first sight of the crescent moon over the desert. And so this gets incorporated into Muhammad's belief system. And they had this rock they thought had fallen from the moon. And they would kiss the rock, walk around the rock, bow to this rock. Muhammad kissed this rock, and it got incorporated into his belief system. And that rock, along with 360 other pagan gods, was in this square building called the Kaaba. And the Zoroastrians were the Persians, and they believed that paradise was filled full of virgins that would fulfill all the guy's desires. Muhammad heard this, and it got incorporated into his belief system. The Zoroastrians also believed in jinns, or genies, that followed people around, right, like poltergeists or demons or whatever. And matter of fact, the word genius was not somebody with a high IQ. It was somebody that had a genie that followed them around and told them all the answers. So the next time somebody says, "You're a genius," you can say, "No, I just have a high IQ." And then Muhammad could not read, which was not uncommon for that area of the world. Even in 2011, 30 to 40% of people in Egypt today cannot read, according to the UN Development Program report. So the Jews and Christians could read. They were the people of the book. And so Muhammad was, you ask, how can somebody that's illiterate memorize all these verses? Well, in Arabic, they had a little rhyme to them, a little beat, very similar to rap music today. So maybe there's a student that cannot read in school, but he memorizes these long rap songs. And so Thomas Carlyle wrote in 1840, Arabs see more method in it than we. Much of it is rhythmic, a kind of wild chanting. And so the story is that Muhammad was following the Christians at the 5th century, had embraced a hyper-pietism. It was this thought that if you really become a Christian, you should give away your money and live in a cave. If you really become a Christian, you should give away your money and join a monastery so we'll never see you again. Or give away your money and build a platform in the desert, climb on top, baking the sun, thinking you're denying your flesh and getting holier. There's all this me-focused salvation. Well, Muhammad followed their example. He decided he was going to go into a cave and pray. And a spirit appeared to him and squeezed him and commanded him to read. He said, I cannot read. The spirit squeezed him the second time, said, read. He said, I cannot read. The spirit squeezed him the third time, said, read. He said, I cannot read. Finally, the spirit threw him down, and Muhammad began to recite. That's how the Quran came to Muhammad. You get the verses, you repeat them until he had them memorized. So the word Quran means recitation because it is an oral thing because Muhammad and his original followers were illiterate. And so Muhammad was never able to read the Old Testament, but he heard their oral stories called Talmud and Mishnah, and some of those stories got incorporated into his belief system. And then there's the Christian faith. and even Encyclopedia Britannica stated of Muhammad, the gospel was known to him chiefly through apocryphal and heretical sources. So Muhammad thought the Trinity was the Father, Mary, and Jesus. Nobody explained to him the Holy Spirit. So there are Muslims today that think Christians are polytheists, worshiping three gods, the Father, Mary, and Jesus. Now, what's apocryphal? Those are books that are not inspired, so they're not in our Bible. One of the apocryphal books was the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, written several centuries after Christ by someone who knew nothing of Jewish life, and it's filled full of so many errors and inconsistencies that no scholar takes it serious. Yet, it was floating around the desert with its stories, and Muhammad heard them, and some of them got incorporated into his belief system. So the Infancy Gospel says that Jesus spoke from the cradle when he was an infant, that he made clay birds and clapped, and they flew away and raised a playmate from the dead. Guess what stories Muhammad heard? That Jesus spoke from the cradle, made clay birds and clapped, and flew away and raised a playmate from the dead. And now these stories are in the Quran, and they take them as fact. Yet, we know where they came from, and no Bible scholar takes them serious. And then it says heretical. The gospel is known to him chiefly through apocryphal and heretical sources. The first 3 centuries of Christianity, they didn't live long enough to argue over doctrine. They were thrown to the lions in the Colosseum. After that, the Christians began to argue over doctrine. And the first heresy was Arianism. And Arius said Jesus was a little less than God. He was a created being. And then there was Nestorianism that said Jesus was mostly God and a little bit man. Then there was Docetism that said Jesus was completely God and only appeared man. And then there was Ebionism that said Jesus was completely man and he was still the Messiah. See how complicated this is? Imagine if you were illiterate in the desert, hearing all these heresies, hearing the Jewish oral traditions and the apocryphal stuff and the Zoroastrian stuff and the pagan stuff. And so Muhammad starts his faith in 610 AD, and he's very excited about it and feels like there's something in it for everyone, and probably anticipates everyone in the world is going to join and it's going to unite the world. Well, he only makes 70 converts in 12 years, and he begins to get confrontational, and he hangs around that square building called the Kaaba, and he insults the pagans and tells them that they're going to burn in hell. And so these pagans feel like Muhammad is a disturber of the peace. And in 619 AD, his wife Khadijah dies. His uncle, who was the merchant that he went on rides with, his uncle Abu Talib dies. And so the people of Mecca decide that they would chase Muhammad out of town. And so he tries going to a city called Al-Taif. They don't want him, they pelt him with rocks and stones. And so then Muhammad tries to go to a city called Medina. It's a Jewish city, right? So in a sense, Muhammad is a Muslim refugee. And he goes to this Jewish city in Medina, and they're nice, and they let Muhammad in as a Muslim immigrant. And Muhammad goes into the minority neighborhoods in Medina, and he finds some pagans who have grievances against the Jewish government. And he organizes a following. We're familiar with the term of organizing in the community, right? He gets a following, and when it's sufficiently large enough, he pressures the Jews to accommodate him and his followers politically. They do, and make a treaty. So now Muhammad is a political leader in addition to being a religious leader. Then Muhammad's followers in Mecca get confrontational, argumentative, threatening, protesting, and then the people of Mecca decide they are disturbers of the peace, and they chase them out of town. They are Muslim refugees. They go north to the Jewish city of Medina, and the Jews are nice and let them in as Muslim immigrants. And Muhammad allows his followers to rob the caravans headed to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing them out of town. And so there's the caravan routes, and it goes through Medina, and Muhammad and his men would rob them, and what's left would go to Mecca. So where Jesus said, if they take your coat, give them your shirt, Muhammad's attitude was, if they take your house, you retaliate, take their caravan. He had 300 warriors, they would rob caravans. Muhammad gets a whole chapter of the Quran, it's Surah 8, chapter 8, on how to distribute booty from robbing caravans. Muhammad gets a fifth of the booty. And so the Meccans send 1,000 soldiers to escort and protect their caravan. And Muhammad, with 300 warriors, defeats 1,000 at the Battle of Badr in 624 AD. This amazing victory, having been outnumbered 3-1, convinces Muhammad to be a military leader. And he fights in 66 battles and raids in the next 8 years before he dies. He even used the catapult when he attacked a city called Al-Taif. And when he was told the catapult was killing women and children, Muhammad's response was, they are among them, so they got to be killed too. So suicide bombers and ISIS killers say it's okay to kill innocent people to advance Islam because Muhammad did when he used the catapults at Al-Taif. And so he fights in these 66 battles and raids in the next 8 years before he dies. And he transitions from a religious leader to a political leader to a military leader. So it's RPM, like in your car, revolutions per minute. And so there's freedom for all religions in America. But Islam is not just a religion, because Muhammad was not just a religious leader. He was a political and a military leader. So a mosque is a religious building, a political building, and a military building. Bowing to Mecca is a religious bowing, a political bowing, and a military pledging of allegiance to another capital. And our effort in the West to split the religious side of Islam away from the political military side is we're trying to split Muhammad. Who are we to split their prophet? He was all three. And so Alexis de Tocqueville in 1840 writes, Muhammad put into the Quran not religious doctrines only, but political maxims, criminal and civil laws with punishments. So even he admits it's not just a religion. It's a political and a military system. And so there are two sets of verses in the Quran based on the two cities Muhammad lived in. In Mecca, Muhammad was a religious leader, and so those verses are relatively more peaceful. In Medina, he transitions to being a political and a military leader, and those verses are more violent. And the later verses supersede or abrogate the earlier verses. So, for example, in the Bible, we have an Old Testament and a New Testament. Old Testament has some violence in it. Moses and Joshua wiping out the tribes in the Promised Land. The New Testament, Jesus and the apostles never killed anyone. And so what do we say? WWJD, what would Jesus do? The later example is the one we're going to strive to imitate. It's the same way in Islam, only in reverse. Their peaceful verses came first. When Muhammad was a religious leader in Mecca, they are called weak verses, and they're superseded by the later verses that come in Medina. They're the political, military, and violent verses. Does that make sense? So the last example Muhammad left was the political, military example. So Muslim scholars lay out Muhammad's life in a timeline. And if he gets a revelation at one point and later gets something that contradicts it, they take the later example as the one that erases the earlier one. And then if he gets another revelation that contradicts that one, then it's the later one. So it's this progressive timeline. Since 627 AD, the Meccans are tired of their caravans being robbed. And so they send 10,000 soldiers to Medina to stop Muhammad and his warriors from robbing the caravans. And it turns out Muhammad is a brilliant military leader, primarily because he's creative, he's unconventional, he's unpredictable. He doesn't play by the rules of traditional Arab warfare. So these pagans had 1 month off a year where they agreed not to fight. It was their pilgrimage month. These pagans would lay aside their differences and go on their camel rides to that square building called the Kaaba. Well, Muhammad gets verses from his Allah instructing him to rob the caravans during this month, and he catches them off guard and comes away with a lot of booty. And so as these 10,000 Meccans are marching toward Medina, Muhammad's version of roadside bombs was he dug potholes all around the city, which rendered the superior cavalry of the Meccans useless. You cannot charge your horse and camel across a field full of potholes, they'll break their legs. Throws off the battle strategy. So Muhammad goes to some of the tribes at night and he bribes them and they slip away. He goes to some of the other tribes at night and he threatens them and they slip away. Sort of the Chicago politics, the bribe or the bullet, the silver or the lead. Then it gets freezing cold for a week, and the rest of the Meccans lose heart and decide to retreat and bring their troops home. And so it leaves a power vacuum, very similar to 2010, when President Obama declared war in Iraq and Afghanistan was over, mission complete, and he brings all of our troops home and he leaves a power vacuum. Did they get more peaceful? No, they began what John Kerry described was a genocide. And so when Muhammad saw these Meccans retreating, did he become more peaceful? No, he was emboldened that his enemies were cowards and unable to subdue him. So he goes back into that Jewish city of Medina. And remember those 3 Jewish tribes that let Muhammad in 5 years earlier? One of the tribes does something that offends Muhammad. And he whips his followers into a frenzy. They attack that Jewish neighborhood, confiscate their property, and chase them out of town. Then he picks on the 2nd Jewish tribe. And they did something that offends him. He confiscates their property, chases them out of town. This set a precedent in Islam called hudna, H-U-D-N-A, hudna. It means when you're weak, you make treaties until you get strong enough to disregard them. So here we are twisting Israel's arm to make a treaty with the Palestinians, when the Palestinian concept of a treaty is just a ceasefire to restock missiles and dig more tunnels. Here we are having a treaty with Iran, when the Iranian concept of a treaty is just to put your enemy off so you can finish your nuclear missile program. Anyway, the 3rd Jewish tribe, Muhammad bottles in their neighborhood for 25 days. When they surrender, Muhammad brings them into the market and he chops off their heads. 600 or 700 Jewish men get their heads chopped off, and the women and children are sold into slavery. He did keep one of the Jewish wives for himself, Rehana. He ended up having 11 to 22 wives. But within 5 years of Muhammad coming into the Jewish city of Medina, there is not a Jew left in the city of Medina. They were chased out, killed, or enslaved. And within 5 years of Muhammad's death, every pre-existing culture in Arabia was wiped out. And so we see it's a 3-step process. Like Caesar's 3 steps, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. Muhammad's 3 steps was immigrate, increase, eliminate. Immigrate into the host country as a religious refugee. Increase the number of your followers amongst those who have grievances that are minorities, and begin to demand political accommodation. And then you have random outbreaks of violence and drive the former inhabitants out of the neighborhoods. This process is observable in Europe and even in America. I was speaking in Detroit, visiting with people afterwards, and a lady had a ministry to pregnant moms. She shows up at a Muslim house with a little present. While she is there, out of a bedroom comes another pregnant Muslim mom. Out of a bedroom comes another pregnant Muslim mom. Out of a bedroom comes another pregnant Muslim mom. All pregnant by the same man. He's practicing Sharia law polygamy in his house in Dearborn, Michigan. And then I'm visiting with somebody who says, oh, Faisal bought a bunch of houses on the block, and he has a wife in each one. And the wives go down to the welfare office and say, the husband's not around. And they get these checks. And he visits the wives, and the more children they have, the larger the checks get. He is living like a king at state expense, and all the kids playing in the middle of the street are his kids. He's practicing Sharia law polygamy on his block in Dearborn, Michigan. They take over several more blocks and they vote in the school board. And so now they have their gymnasiums, and they're 5 times a day where there's prayer. They have the boys at the front bowing and praying, the girls behind them, and then the girls at their time of month behind them. Because Muhammad said, if a dog, a donkey, or a woman passes between you and Mecca when you're praying, your prayers are invalidated. But then they take over several more blocks and they vote in the police department, the fire department, all these different boards, and chase out the former inhabitants. Here is from last year. Hamtramck, Michigan, used to be a Polish neighborhood. And the Muslims first came in and they were nice, and then they let more in, and then so they finally formed a community in Oma, and then they began to grow more in numbers, began to demand. So now they voted in the first majority Muslim city council. And they said, today we show the Polish. So Because last week, Michigan City of Hamtramck elected a new city council, and with it they ushered in the first Muslim majority. Within moments, they began to threaten the polls. And they set up their minarets with their loudspeakers and their calls to prayer 5 times a day, starting at 4:30 in the morning. Well, there's a 1,400-year track record of illustrating this pattern of coming into host communities as religious refugees, increasing in number and demanding political accommodation, and then driving out and eliminating the previous inhabitants. And so the growth of Islam can be broken into 3 categories, 3 springs. We're familiar with the term of Arab Spring. So the first was an Arab-Persian spring that went from 622 to 1071. Second is a Turkish spring that goes from 1071 to 1923 when the Ottoman Empire falls. Remember I talked about the Ottoman Empire falling? And then the third Arab Spring started in 1928 with the Muslim Brotherhood, the Wahhabi, the ISIS, the Al-Qaeda, and so forth. So they do something very effective called psychological projection, called blame shifting, where the attacker blames the victim. And Karl Marx said, accuse others of what you do. And Sigmund Freud said, rude and hateful people accuse others of being rude and hateful. Right? So little kids do this. I'm not the mean one, you're the mean one. And so they'll protest calling a group hateful when they're actually the hateful ones. Right? Now politicians do this. They'll accuse the other politician of being corrupt when they're actually the corrupt one. David Axelrod, the former president's campaign advisor, said in Chicago politics we have a tradition. Throw a brick through your own campaign office window and then call a press conference to accuse your opponent. So they're the ones doing the hateful things, but they have the audacity to accuse others of being hateful. Anyway, so as Islam grew, they'd come up to villages and offer them peace. And if they submitted, they got peace. If not, they had war. And their goal, again, is a global state called the Caliphate. And just so happens that at the time of Muhammad and the rightly guided caliphs, there was a new military advantage called the stirrup. Now, the stirrup was invented in Mongolia. And they had little short horses, and they would tie a rope around the horse and leave 2 loops hanging for their big toes because they would ride barefoot. And it would help them keep balance. That invention made its way to China in the 5th century AD. That invention made its way across the China Silk Road, the Gobi Desert, to Persia. The Persians made the stirrups out of metal with leather straps. And at the same time at Damascus, they developed something called Damascus steel. Very light, like a razor blade, and flexible. And so the Europeans were using these big, heavy metal swords that took 2 hands, and they fought on foot. Muslims were on horseback with their stirrups and their scimitar swords, and at a full gallop, they literally could slice someone in half. And so they happened to get not only this Islamic motivation, but this military advantage. Now, this is the U.S. Supreme Court chamber in Washington, D.C. It has a marble frieze of relief sculptures around the ceiling. It does have Moses and his 10 Hebrew commandments and Charlemagne and John Marshall, but it has Muhammad with his Arabic crown and his what? His scimitar sword. And this is Muhammad's sword. Still exists in Istanbul, Turkey, in the Topkapi Museum Palace where the Sultan was. And anyway, so Muhammad's general was Khalid ibn al-Walid. He was undefeated in over 100 battles. He would do these pincer movements. He'd defeat the Persian armies and the Byzantine armies and the apostate Muslims who wanted to leave after Muhammad died. And again, as I mentioned, the Muslims conquered Syria. Did you know Syria was the first country that was completely Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul? Antioch, Syria is where the name Christian was first used. And there's more ancient Christian writing in the Syrian language of Syriac than any other language other than Greek and Latin. You want to go to seminary and study ancient Christian writing, you're going to study Greek and Latin and Syriac. And these Syrian Christians evangelized east like the Greek Christians did west. These Syrian Christians evangelized into India, Mongolia, even China. During the Tang Dynasty in the 600s, had a thriving Syrian Christian community. It was largely wiped out by a Muslim leader named Tamerlane. And then the Muslims conquered Yemen, which used to be a Jewish kingdom. They conquered Jerusalem, which had been a Byzantine Christian city since Constantine. Remember, his mom, St. Helena, was building cathedrals there. And then Muslims conquered Egypt, which was completely Christian, evangelized by the apostle, Mark, the gospel writer, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa. They're conquered by the Umayyad Muslims. They conquered Cyprus, Rhodes, Sicily, and then they invaded into Spain. All this happened within 23 years of Muhammad's death. One of the fastest growing empires that planet Earth has ever seen. Went from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean. And when the Muslims conquered Egypt, there was the largest library in the world in Alexandria. Went back to Alexander the Great, Roman times. They translated the Septuagint there, right? The Greek translation of the Old Testament. It was the center of learning for the ancient world. And when the Muslim warriors came into Alexandria, the story is that they asked Caliph Umar what to do with these thousands of old books. And Caliph Umar's response was, every book that does not agree with the Quran, destroy. And every book that does agree with the Quran is redundant because we have the Quran. So destroy them all. It supposedly took 6 months to burn them all. Well, that was in 642 AD. This was just last year. Breitbart News article, ISIS militants raided the central library of Mosul, Iraq, the old Nineveh, to destroy all non-Islamic books. These books promote infidelity, call for disobeying Allah, announced the militant to the residents, so they will be burned. So they're doing the same thing today that they did back in 642 AD. So whereas a lot of Muslims wanted to get away from that example, and they wanted to modernize, become more progressive, there's been this reawakening of the Wahhabi with the Saudi oil and the spreading of this original fundamental version of Islam. And one of the main sources of paper in the world was papyrus reeds from Egypt. And when the Muslims conquered Egypt, they held back the ships of papyrus. And so there was suddenly a paper shortage in the Roman Empire. And the Romans began to write fewer books. And this was the beginning of the Dark Ages. And it cut off all the trade across the Mediterranean. Again, this was within 100 years of Muhammad's death. And so Europe economically had a heart attack. Very similar to if China held their ships back today for a couple months, all of our Walmart shelves would be empty. Well, that's what happened. And then in the year 711, 80,000 Muslims invaded Spain. Spaniards are still fighting on foot with heavy metal swords. Muslims are on Arabian horses with stirrups and scimitar swords. In 10 years, they conquer all of Spain, carry away over 1 million into slavery. And then they cross the Pyrenees Mountains. You read the story of the Battle of Bordeaux in southern France. In one pass, the Muslim cavalry annihilated the Frankish army. And so, you read the story, the Franks are on foot, heavy metal sword, the Muslim cavalry is charging, and the ground is rumbling, and in one pass, the Muslim cavalry annihilates the entire Frankish army. They turn around for a second, go at it, they're all dead. They were literally unstoppable in setting up their ISIS, their Islamic State, their caliphate. So Pope Gregory puts out a plea that anybody that could fight should join Charles Martel. He was the grandfather of Charlemagne. Charles Martel gets 30,000 volunteers, and they stop the Muslims at the Battle of Tours, just outside of Paris, in the year 732 AD, exactly 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. They go from Arabia to Paris in a 100-year military campaign. And since this is the 1st century of Islam, there are some Muslims that look to that as the example, the same way Christians look back to the 1st century of Christianity as the example of Jesus and the early church and so forth. Well, had Charles Martel not stopped them at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, you and I would be speaking Arabic right now, because German, French, English, and Spanish would have never developed as languages. We'd be like Egypt, where the Muslims cut out the tongues of anybody caught speaking Coptic. That's how they eradicated the entire national The word Coptic is the Egyptian word for Egyptian, but now they speak Arabic in there. And so Charles Martel had the largest army in Europe at the time, Had he not stopped them, they were unopposed all the way to Poland. Interesting battle. Charles Martel didn't like standing in the field waiting for the cavalry to charge, so he put his men on top of the hill in a square. He had 30,000 volunteers, they're all on foot, and they're on the top of this hill. And so the Muslim cavalry is charging up the hill. From their vantage point, looks like a line. They're going to charge through like they did at the Battle of Bordeaux. They charge in and get stuck because it's 30,000 guys packed together in one square. Meanwhile, Charles Martel had arranged for some of his men to sneak into the Muslim camp and free the captives. You see, they fought for religion, but they also fought for plunder. You could come away from battle with some extra women, right? Muhammad said you can have 4 wives plus as many extra women as your right hand possesses, as many as you take in battle. They just don't have the status of a wife, so they're slave wives and concubines and so forth. Now, the Sultan got 1/5 of the spoil, so many sultans had 1,000 wives. One sultan reportedly had 12,000 wives. Well, as these Muslim warriors saw these captives being let go from the camp, they would sneak away from the fighting to try to reclaim their booty. And the Muslim commander, Abdul Rahman, tries to rally his soldiers back to the fight. He gets distracted, he gets killed. And now the Muslim warriors cannot decide who their next commander is going to be. They begin to bicker. They pick up and go back to Spain. That was the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. Anyway, Charles Martel gets every horse he can find, learns how to make a stirrup, trains his men. 5 years later, he wins his first battle. And it takes 700 years of battles to drive the Muslims out of Spain. One of the Spanish commanders was El Cid, Rodrigo Diaz. And the story is that here's Charlton Heston did a movie. I met Charlton Heston. He endorsed me when I ran for Congress years ago. He was the head of the NRA. I'm dating myself. But anyway, so Rodrigo Diaz is charging, and he needs one more charge to win the battle, but he's wounded. His men look at him and say, "You're bleeding to death. You're not going to survive." He goes, "Well, I'm going to die anyway. Put me back on the horse, tie me on really tight." They open the gates of the city. They slap his horse. He goes off riding. His men go, "There goes El Cid." They hop on their horses. They go off riding, and they win the battle. After the victory, they're all celebrating. They go, "Where's El Cid?" They see him over there on his horse, sort of drooped over. It's one of those romantic chick flicks. You know, hey, let's watch El Cid. The Notebook or El Cid? I don't know. Anyway, so they take 700 years to drive the Muslims out of Spain. Courageous battles at Toledo and Saragossa and Seville and Granada. But then they come around the other side of the Mediterranean and they attack New York City. It wasn't New York, but it was the equivalent. It was Constantinople. It was the biggest city in Europe. It was where the East and West met. It was the big trade city, right? The China Silk Road ended there. And anyway, the Muslims tried attacking, but this time the defenders of Constantinople had the military advantage. Greek fire. This is where you take oil and sawdust, mix it into this sort of a napalm type of gel, spray it out of hot oil cannons, and it turned the Muslims back. So all of that was the first Arab Spring. It went from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean. Now after they had conquered all this, and they were stopped, the Muslim world began to go into its maintaining phase. So this is the Arab Persians, they're maintaining, and during this time they discover some of the Greek classics. You begin to get some Muslim philosophers that wanted to try to introduce some Greek thought and everything, but then it sort of gets slapped down. I'll tell you about it. And then the Turks convert to Islam, and that becomes the second wave. And so some definitions. The word Islam means submission to the will of Allah. A Muslim is one who has submitted to the will of Allah. And Islam believes there will be world peace when the whole world submits to the will of Allah. So Islam is a religion of peace. It's just their definition of the word peace is different than our definition. Our definition of peace is when different groups get along. Their definition of world peace is world Islam. So when they say they want world peace, they really want world Islam. They want the whole world to submit to the will of Allah. So Abraham Lincoln said, "We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. We all want peace, but when we say it, it's not the same as when they say it." So Islam divides the world in two. The half that has submitted to the will of Allah, and the half that's in the process of submitting to the will of Allah. The half that's submitted is the house of Islam, the house of submission, Dar al-Islam. The half that's in the process of submitting is the Dar al-Harb, the house of war. The non-Muslim world is supposed to be at war because it's in the process of being forced to submit. What about moderate Muslims? Most Muslims are moderate. Moderate Muslims believe the world will submit to Allah later. Maybe in the distant future, maybe at the end of the world. And since it's so far off, they just want to live their lives, have their families, and they're happy and content to live next to you, a kafir infidel. The fundamental Muslim, they think the world is supposed to submit to Allah now. And they're really excited and they want to help make it happen. Now the dilemma we face in the West is the more we bend over backwards in unprecedented ways to show ourselves nice and friendly and tolerant and accommodating and really careful not to offend them, the modern Muslim begins to rethink and say, wait a second, this has never, ever happened before. Maybe the world is in fact submitting to Allah now rather than later. And so they gravitate from the future, it's going to happen in the distant mindset into the it's happening now mindset. So the dilemma is the nicer the West shows itself, the more violent the fundamental Muslims become. In Islam, they have a concept: when your enemy shows weakness, that's Allah giving them to you. So it's sort of like the law of the jungle applied ideologically. So a lion is chasing a zebra, the zebra trips to the lion's paws or pounce. My daughter had a friend who led tours of the zoo for students, and he had one student who would walk in front of the wolf cage, and the wolf wouldn't even bother looking at the kid. As the same kid walked in front of the wolf cage, limping and jerking and acting like he's injured, dragging his feet, all of a sudden the wolves would look at the kid, and they begin to zero in on him. They begin to pan, they begin to walk back and forth, figuring out how they can get across the ditch and get him. Weakness invites aggression. I mean, sharks can sense a distressed animal in the water, and they're actually drawn to want to go over and attack the distressed animal. Right? And so, the dilemma the West faces is that the nicer the West shows itself, there's a percentage of Muslims that view that niceness as weakness, and they take that as an invitation to attack. So here's interview with psychologist Nikolai Sennels. He says, Muslims instinctively see our lack of reaction as fear. It is an invitation to attack. I talked with Kamal Salim, a former Muslim terrorist who became a Christian. He says, when you're afraid of a Muslim, they feel like that it's Allah that put the fear into your heart, and it's an indicator to them that they are supposed to attack you. So when you're afraid of a Muslim, they think, hey, that's an indicator I'm supposed to attack you. Another word to define is the word innocent. When the terrorist attacks happen, politicians are quick to tell us that those terrorists do not represent true Islam, because Islam says it's wrong to kill the innocent. Let's define the word innocent. Innocent is a faithful follower of the way of Allah. So if you are not a faithful follower of the way of Allah, you are guilty. And so it says, Allah loveth not those who reject the faith. Be ruthless to the infidels. Make war on the infidels. Fight those who believe not in Allah. Kill the disbeliever wherever you find them. So when they say it's wrong to kill the innocent, it's code for it's wrong to kill faithful Muslims. Now, in all due respect, the fundamental Muslims that are doing the killing, they view the large number of non-violent Muslims as having left the way of Allah. And so they're just as happy to kill a non-violent Muslim as they are to kill an infidel. Anyway, so here is one of those political Muslims named Joram Kadari in London, which now has a Muslim mayor. And he says, we have had enough of democracy and man-made law. We call for a complete upheaval of the British ruling system and demand full implementation of Sharia in Britain. So while most Muslims are happy to live in the non-Muslim world and have their lives and families, you have a small percentage that actually want to overthrow the laws and set up their Sharia law. What's Sharia? It's trying to be like Muhammad. He was the perfect Muslim. And so what Christians want to be like Jesus, Muslims want to be like Muhammad. Simple. Except Christians do not believe they go to heaven by being like Jesus. Christians believe they go to heaven because Jesus died on the cross to pay for all of their sins. And they're so thankful that they received the forgiveness, they want to show the world how much God loves them. Not so in Islam. They think their percentages of going to paradise is based on how closely they can imitate Muhammad. And so what Muhammad permitted is permitted. That is called halal. What Muhammad did not permit is not permitted. That is called haram. So Muhammad liked cats. Cats are halal. They are permitted. Muhammad did not like dogs. Dogs are haram. They are not permitted. And so Sharia law is a long list of halals and harams. What's permitted and what's not permitted. And it's the local imam that keeps the list. And they would say to the imam, is this permitted? Yes, that's halal. Is this permitted? No, that's haram. And as long as you're following the list, you're safe. And so the list, the Sharia, comes from 4 categories. The Quran, private revelations to Muhammad, in 2 sets of verses, the peaceful ones that came in Mecca and the political militant ones that came in Medina. Sharia law comes from the Hadith, 60,000 stories remembered about Muhammad from his wives and warriors. And they would say, I remember the Prophet did this, I remember the Prophet did that. All those I remembers are put down, that is called the Hadith. And then there's the Sirat, the biography of Muhammad, written 100 years after his death. It puts his life in chronological order. If you're going to read something first, I would recommend reading the Sirat first. Of course, if you're going to read anything first, I'd recommend you read my book first. Anyway, and then there's 1,400 years of rulings of Muslim scholars interpreting the Quran, the Hadith, and the Sirat. Sharia law is very complicated. It decides what you believe, what you eat, how you dress. Ladies, you struggle over what to wear. Don't worry, it's all taken care of for you. When to pray, you don't just pray anytime you want. It's 5 specific times, and they have their loudspeakers that tells you what direction. You can't just pray in any direction. You have to pray toward Mecca. What position you're in when you pray, how many wives to have, the correct way to beat a wife. You can go online to these Muslim websites and listen to these imams, and it says when you lift your hand to beat your wife, you should not lift your hand above your head when you strike her. And you should not use anything thicker than your thumb to strike her with. And you should not strike her on the face, just elsewhere on her body. In this way, Allah is showing honor to the woman. I think I get it. And who must accompany a woman in public? Ladies, if you're cooking and you forgot something, you cannot just leave the house and go to the store. You have to have a male relative with you when you leave your house. If you leave without a male relative, you could be accused of rape. And if you get raped, it's your fault for allowing yourself to be used as a tool of Satan to tempt the man. So you get punished with 100 whips. So you have to wear the burqa to look unattractive on purpose. Now you can leave the house with a little grandson, that counts, but you have to have a male relative with you who can be your friends, and you can't drink alcohol. Man can have 4 wives. He can beat his wives, marry girls as young as 6. All he has to do to say, to divorce his wife is to say, I divorce you 3 times. Guess what? Last year, the Al-Azhar University said all you have to do is text your wife 3 times. I divorce you. And she can't even go back in the house and get her clothes. It is over. Wife gets no help. She'll never see her kids again. And anyway. Now, they have slavery. And they enslaved over 1.5 million Europeans. And there were whole Catholic orders in Europe through the Middle Ages called the Trinitarians. The head of the order was called the ransomer. And they would collect alms and donations and go under a white flag to North Africa to get your friend back. And they raided the Mediterranean. And they even raided in the Atlantic. And in the 1600s, they even raided Ireland. The stolen village of Baltimore, Ireland. Muslim pirates came up at nighttime, killed a bunch, and rounded up the whole town, took them to Morocco, sold them into slavery. They even captured one of the pilgrim ships. In 1625, the pilgrims had saved up 800 pounds of beaver skins. Muslims captured it, took it to Morocco, sold them into slavery. And then they enslaved an estimated 180 million Africans. Castrate the men, make them eunuchs, sold women into sex trafficking. The big Muslim slave trading ports were Timbuktu, where the canoe meets the caravan, right, the Niger River, and Count Khartoum in the Sudan, and the Zanzibar coast. And they had slavery of Africans for 8 centuries before America was ever discovered. And they'd sell them throughout the Ottoman Empire, and the forced marriages, and heartbreaking stories. The elderly and young could not survive the forced marches to the slave market. And anyway, then, all right, Columbus discovers the New World. The Spanish claimed the New World for a century. At the same time, Martin Luther's doing the Reformation in Germany. There's a Catholic priest in Mexico named Bartolome de las Casas. He spends his whole life to convince the King of Spain to outlaw the enslavement of Native Americans. And when he is finally successful, the greedy people say, where can we get more slaves? And someone said, Africa. And that began these Portuguese and Spanish, later Dutch, going to the Muslim slave markets and buying the Africans from the Muslim slave markets. Heartbreaking stories. And even in the 1800s it continued. The Scottish missionary to the Congo, David Livingstone, remember Dr. Livingstone, I presume, he goes to the Congo and he writes about stumbling across a line of 500 Africans being marched hundreds of miles to the coast to be sold into Muslim slavery. And if they walk too slow, they just stab them or shoot them. He says you can tell where the slave trails were because of the vultures circling. He comes across a path and there's a woman bleeding to death. He says, what happened? They said, she was walking too slow and the slave trader felt mad because he lost his investment, so he shot her. David Livingstone talks about going through a valley and witnessing to the tribes, comes back a year later, ghost villages. They had all been depopulated and sold into Muslim slavery. Somebody gave David Livingstone a little steamboat, paddle boat to go up the rivers. He says it kept breaking because it would hit the bodies of the Africans the Muslims would throw in. And he writes in his journal, more important than discovering the source of the Nile, if any of my revelations could stop this monster of the Arab Muslim slave trade that hangs over Africa, my life will be worth it. And it still goes on today. There's actually more slavery today than at any other time in world history, and a whole lot of it is in Muslim countries. Mauritania, it's still legal there. In Niger, in Sudan, and so forth. They call it forced marriages and slave labor and so forth. Anyway, well, that was all the first Arab Spring. People say, well, Bill, you just talked about Muslims killing people. Didn't Christians kill people too? What about the Crusades, huh? Well, let's talk about that. That's the Turkish Spring. So 1071 to 1923, the Turks come and they conquer the Arab, Persian, Muslim world, and then they conquer into what is today Turkey. Come in two waves, the Seljuk Turks and then the Ottoman Turks. Well, before we get into that, people say, well, you know, Muslims kill people and Christians kill people. Every religion has crazies that kill people. Well, that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is, let's not compare followers, let's compare founders. If your computer acts up, what do? You reload the software the way it was when you brought it home from the store. If your religion acts up, what do? You go back to the way it was when it left the founder. So let's compare founders. The largest religion in the world is Christianity, around 32%. Second largest religion in the world is Islam, around 23%. Then 16% unaffiliated, 15% Hindu, 7% Buddhist, down to 0.2% Jewish. So let's compare the founders of the two largest religions in the world. Jesus never killed anyone. Muhammad killed an estimated 3,000 people. Jesus never led armies. Muhammad led armies. Jesus never owned slaves. Muhammad owned slaves, even African slaves, because he was a white Arab. There are hadiths that when he lifted his arms to pray, they would see the whiteness of his armpits. Another hadith, the guy was on his donkey, rubbed up against Muhammad, says, I saw the whiteness of the prophet's thigh. Another hadith, some visitors wanted to meet Muhammad, said he is the white man reclining on the couch, and Muhammad owned African slaves. And in Arabic, there's one word for African and slave. It's the same word, abd, or abid. And like Abdullah means slave of Allah. So abd means slave. And so every African they'd see, they'd call him abd, or slave. And anyway, Jesus never married. Muhammad had 11 to 22 wives. Youngest was Aisha, the 6-year-old. And he had a dream 2 nights in a row of him marrying the 6-year-old daughter of his general, Abu Bakr. The general said, you're the prophet, here she is. And she writes about how she was 9 years old, playing in a swing in the backyard, and her mother calls her in, takes a rag, dips in water, washes her face. The Muslim women said, Allah's blessings and good luck. And she said, the prophet visited me that afternoon. I was 9 years old. Jesus never tortured anyone. When Muhammad conquered Khaybar, the last Jewish settlement in Arabia, the chief refused to tell where the tribe's treasure was. Muhammad had the chief stretched out on the ground. They kindled a fire on his chest. Still wouldn't tell. Jesus did not permit lying. Muhammad permitted lying. It's called taqiyya, sacred lying, holy deceit. A couple stories. There was a chieftain planning on attacking Muhammad. Muhammad goes to his warriors, says, "Who will rid me of this chieftain?" This one warrior said, "I will if you permit me to lie." Muhammad said, "Go." So he goes to the chieftain and says, "I've left Muhammad, he's a heretic. I want to help you, but they're after me." The chieftain says, okay, you can spend the night in my tent. You will have my entire army surrounding you. You'll be safe. Well, in the middle of the night, the warrior tiptoes over and beheads the chieftain, grabs his head, runs all the way, gives it to Muhammad, says, "Prophet, Allah's face is shown upon you." Muhammad said, "No, Allah's face is shown upon you." Muhammad gives him his staff and says, "You can lean on this in the day of judgment, because on that day, many people won't have anything to lean upon." Muhammad approved of lying to your infidel enemy so that you can gain the advantage and behead him. Another Muslim warrior was captured and forced to renounce Muhammad. He escaped, went back to Muhammad. Muhammad forgave him, and Muhammad said, "If they make you turn, turn, but don't turn in your heart." In other words, it's okay to deny Muhammad in a pinch to save your skin, as long as you don't fight against Islam. In other words, it's okay to say you're not a Muslim in order to get elected, but then everything you do once you're elected is to help advance Islam. Oh, it's hard to imagine. And so they had slavery, and they raided the islands of the Mediterranean. Did you know in 846 AD, 11,000 Muslims invaded Rome, Italy, and they trashed the Basilica of St. Peter's, and they trashed the bones of St. Peter and St. Paul. And so it was after that that Pope Leo decided to build the 39-foot wall around the Vatican. So here we have the Pope building a wall to keep the Muslims out. Some of you will get that in a minute. And so Muhammad, Jesus never forced anyone to follow him. Muhammad said, "Whoever changes his Islamic religion, kill him." So you're free to join, you just can't leave, sort of like Hotel California. Here's the Egyptian Imam Yusuf Qaradawi. If they had gotten rid of the apostasy punishment, Islam wouldn't exist today. Islam would have ended since the death of the Prophet. When Muhammad died, a bunch of Muslims wanted to leave, and Caliph Abu Bakr, the father of the 6-year-old, said, "Sorry, you can't leave," and killed thousands. He goes on, opposing apostasy is what kept Islam to this day. Ibn Masud's hadith killed these three criminals: the adulterer, the murderer, and the apostate that leaves our community. There are numbers that say 90% of Muslims would leave Islam if you would remove the apostasy punishment, if they weren't threatened with death for leaving. Jesus forgave insults, dying on the cross, saying, "Father, forgive them." Muhammad avenged insults. Ibn Qattal made up poems making fun of Muhammad, had 2 slave girls reciting the poems. Muhammad was insulted by the poem, so he orders them murdered. So the idea of if you insult the prophet, you get killed, goes all the way back to the prophet himself. Jesus did not permit his disciples to rape anyone. Muhammad did, and there's always hadiths that talk about how to do it. None of the apostles were governors or generals. Every one of the caliphs was a governor and a general. Jesus taught God was our Father. In Islam, it is blasphemy to call Allah your Father. Jesus taught we're children of God. In Islam, it's blasphemy to call yourself a child of Allah, because Allah took no wife and has no son. Jesus taught we're made in the image of God. In Islam, Allah has no image. Jesus taught to have a personal relationship with God. In Islam, it's blasphemy to even want to have a personal relationship with Allah, because He is transcendent and unknowable. The first 3 centuries of Christianity, there are 10 major persecutions. Christians are thrown to the lions. They never led an armed resistance against the Roman emperors. The first 3 centuries of Islam, they conquered from Arabia to Paris. People say we're all worshiping the same God. Well, as much as we would like that to be the case, Christianity, the largest religion in the world, says that you have to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. He died on the cross to pay for your sins. You go to heaven. Islam has an unforgivable sin called shirk. S-H-I-R-K, shirk. And they say that if you believe that Jesus is the Son of God that died on the cross to pay for your sins, you have committed the unforgivable sin called shirk that condemns you to hell. So question, how can the same God say, if you believe in Jesus, you go up, and if you believe in Jesus, you go down? Either God is schizophrenic, or we're talking about 2 different gods. If you remember the story, Jesus says, go to a town, preach the gospel. If they do not receive you, shake the dust from your feet and leave. Muhammad's attitude was, go to a town, preach the message. If they do not receive you, wage war on the town. Make them submit.
So we're talking crusades. There's 2 centuries of crusades, 36 major battles. But the Muslims have had 14 centuries of crusades, thousands of battles, killing an estimated 240 million people, still continuing today. So more people have been killed by Muslim jihad crusaders than Idi Amin, Pol Pot, and Hitler, and Stalin, and Mao Zedong all put together. On 240 million people. So we're talking crusades. So the Turks conquer the Arab Persian Muslim world, and now they're invading into what is today Turkey. And the Greeks are very proud. They view themselves as the true Christians because they speak Greek, the language of the New Testament. And so they have to humble themselves and beg the Catholic West for help. Now I like a little trivia to throw in here. Do you know who the most popular Greek saint was? He's up on the screen. It's St. Nicholas. He lived during Roman times, gave to the poor, and so these Greeks would leave presents for each other on the anniversary of his death. The story is that there's a family going bankrupt, and the daughters were going to be sold into prostitution. He throws money in the window at nighttime, but he did it anonymously because he wants the glory to go to God. Anyway, so these Greeks would leave presents for each other on the anniversary of his death, and he's thrown, he becomes a bishop, he's thrown in prison, and then he slaps Arius across the face at the Nicene Council for starting the Arian heresy, so jolly old St. Nick had a little temper. Greeks have all kinds of stories about St. Nicholas. He confronts corrupt politicians, and when the Muslims are invading into Turkey, they were going to trash his grave, sort of like they're doing today. And so in the year 1087, they moved the bones of St. Nicholas over to Bari, Italy, B-A-R-I, Bari, Italy, and they built a cathedral. And the Pope that dedicates the church is Pope Urban II. Now, you may not be up on all your Pope names, but that's the same Pope Urban II that goes to the Council of Clermont and begs these European kings to send help to the Greek Christians. They send help. It's called the First Crusade. So the same Pope that calls for the First Crusade is the one that dedicates the church where St. Nicholas's bones are put there. You like that trivia? Anyway, now it gets even more interesting. I wrote a book about it. You know how Catholic saying is that St. Peter's at the gates of heaven? Well, the Greeks do a take on the verse in the book of Revelation that Jesus will return at the end of the world to judge the living and the dead, riding a white horse. The saints will come back with him riding a white horse. And St. Nicholas is a saint, so he'll be one of those riding a white horse. But since he's such an important saint, the Greeks have him coming back once a year for a little mini judgment. A little checkup on the kids to see who's on the right track, see who's naughty, see who's nice, right? And in Norway, they didn't have horses, so they had him riding a reindeer. And the saints come from heaven, that turns into the North Pole. And the Lamb's Book of Life and Book of Works turns into the Book of the Naughty and the Nice. And the angels turn into the elves, and before you know it, you get off track. But in Holland, they still have St. Nicholas as a bishop coming once a year riding a white horse to check up on the kids. And he has with him a little helper named Zwarte Piet. He's a Muslim and from Spain, because the Muslims control Spain for 700 years. So they would tell the little Dutch kids, if you're good, St. Nicholas will give you a present. If you're naughty, his little Muslim helper will put you in a gunny sack, take you back to Spain, and sell you into Muslim slavery. I had 11 brothers and sisters. I would love to have tormented my little brothers with that one. Hey, might not see you anymore. I was actually speaking someplace, and the guy was from Holland. He says, yeah, everybody in our little neighborhood, all the little boys would go to sleep the night before St. Nicholas came. They would go to sleep with a pocket knife in their pocket. I said, why is that? He goes, that's to cut ourselves out of the gunny sack in case we woke up in there. Here's the one who's putting him in a little bag. Please don't take me, don't take my little brother. The parents are like, oh, we told you should have been a good kid, sorry. And there they are. Now I share that because this was this thing that haunted Europe. And then this is the bridge over the river in Prague. If you've ever been there, it's a beautiful city. And but they have statues there. So here's the Muslim Sultan with the sword, and there's the cage. And this is his Catholic order that is ransoming back the slaves. And so there's Pope Urban II calling for the First Crusade. Here's this Byzantine emperor begging for help. They send the First Crusade. There's 2 centuries of crusades. Richard the Lionheart leads the Third Crusade. You know who he left in charge of England? His brother King John, and the Nottingham and the Sherwood Forest, and the who? Robin Hood stories that took place during the Third Crusade. And you know who led the 7th and 8th Crusades against the Muslims? St. Louis, he was the King Louis IX, the most powerful monarch in Europe. When the Crusades end, the Muslims pick up where they left off and they invade into Europe. And so in the 1300s, the Crusades are now over. Muslims still control all of Spain. North Africa, the Zanzibar coast, Madagascar, over to Indonesia, northern Indian Mughal, Central Asia, and into the Middle East and Eastern Europe. And now, this is after they conquer it all, they have Muslim philosophers that want to moderate their faith. They discover the Greek classics, and they become experts in Greek philosophy, and they're trying to sort of reckon Islam with the Greek thought. One of them is Al-Farabi, and he was famous during the golden age of Islam. Another is Avicenna, and he tries to incorporate Greek science and philosophy during this golden age and want to moderate the faith and say, well, let's get away from the example. Averroes was a very prominent Muslim philosopher, and he tries to incorporate the Greek science and philosophy, and he lived in 1126 to 1198. But these guys are slapped down by Ghazali, and he's considered the most influential Muslim after Muhammad. He was a mujahideen, or renewer of the faith. He shut down Greek philosophy and thought, and at the point of history, Europe was still in the Dark Ages, and it had sort of a closed mind when it came to science and so forth. And Islam was discovering these Greek classics, and it had an open mind. And if you were to look at it in history, you would have thought that Islam would have been the belief system that gave birth to the science and philosophy and so forth. But this Ghazali slapped it down. And he was so effective to say, no, don't get into Greek philosophy, get back to following Muhammad. And here's something he said. So Ghazali said, one should restrain anyone who would immerse himself in these mathematical sciences, right? Because the Greeks were into geometry. And he says, for even though they do not pertain to the domain of religion, yet since they are among the foundations of the philosopher's sciences, the student will be infected with the evil and corruption of the philosophers. So it's like, don't even study math. And so this was the closing of the Muslim mind, where at the same time, you have in the West, St. Thomas Aquinas. And he is getting into these Greek classics and writing all of his summas and so forth. And he said, truth is truth, even if a non-Christian stumbles across it. This opens up the Catholic Western mind that goes on to create universities. And so you have the University of Bologna and Paris and Naples and Toulouse and Oxford. And so this was a turning point where the Islamic mind became more fundamental and the European Catholic mind began to open up, and it happened just in time for the Renaissance. Now, meanwhile, Tamerlane, a Muslim leader, conquers all of Central Asia, kills 17 million people. He was called the Sword of Islam. He tells his men to come back with a skull in every hand. He asks his generals where the infidels were. He could kill them. They said, Delhi, India. He leaves pyramids of skulls there. And his descendant is Babur, who founds the Mughal Empire in northern India, whose descendant Shah Jahan built the Taj Mahal. And the story is that Shah Jahan did not want another building that could rival its beauty. So he made the workers stick out their hands and chopped them off. That's what the story is. And now Shah Jahan tried to exterminate the Sikhs. Who are the Sikhs? You've seen them with the towels on their head, and you at first think, oh, these are Muslims. No, they are not Muslims. They're Sikhs. And Shah Jahan tried to exterminate them. He sent his armies out. Where are they? Well, there's a bunch of them by the mountain. Pin them up and just kill them. Well, then the Muslims are invading into Eastern Europe. And these courageous leaders in Albania, Wallachia, Moldova, Bulgaria are fighting off this Muslim horde so the Europeans can have their Renaissance, right? And they started the Order of St. George of the Dragon Slayer. And the Romanian pronunciation of dragon, which was the Sultan, the dragon was Dracula. And the Romanian king was Vlad, the Impaler. Right? Why was he called that? Because the Muslims were invading Romania, demanding 500 boys a year for their Muslim pederasty, their homosexual culture. So in Islam, the homosexual is the person on the receiving end. I won't get into it all. And they would capture these Christian boys. And so they were demanding 500 boys a year. It was women for children, boys for pleasure. And so Vlad said, no more Romanian boys are going to go to the Muslims, and he impales 20,000 of them. It's called the Forest of the Impaled. And so 100,000 Muslim army is charging into Romania. They go through the Forest of the Impaled, see all these bodies writhing, they turn and leave. So Vlad's concept was to out-terrorize the terrorists. And it worked, and he was considered a hero in Romania to this day. And I won't get into it. But anyway, so 1450, the Ottoman Muslims crossed the Bosporus. That was the New York City, Constantinople. And so this purple is what's left of the great Byzantine Empire. What are the green and brown? Those are Venetian and Genoan merchant territories. And they're selling, get this, the Venetians and Genoans are selling military goods to the Ottoman Muslims, who are using them against the Christian defenders of Constantinople. So you have financial interests in the West betraying the West to Islam for money. Very similar to those that are selling out to the Sauds and the Saudi oil, because they want money even though they know the Sauds are funding ISIS and all that. Sultan Mehmed sends over his navy, sends over his army. What's that thing? It's a cannon. They took the church bells from the Greek churches, melted it into the largest cannon in the world. You could shoot a 1,200-pound stone cannonball over a mile. So they still want the largest cannon, but instead of gunpowder, it's nuclear power. Anyway, Sultan Mehmed conquers Constantinople 1453 and sells people into slavery, turns the largest Christian church in the world into a mosque, and cuts off the trade routes between Europe and India and China. Even the first century, the Romans traded with the Han dynasty, and even in 1271, Marco Polo goes from Venice, Italy to China. And Marco Polo brings back to Europe spaghetti noodles, gunpowder, thread from worms, silkworms. Talks about the Chinese inventing plates made out of China. We call it China because it came from China. Chinese invented the wheelbarrow, the compass, the Pony Express, the piñata, and the Chinese invented paper from tree pulp rather than from papyrus reeds. And what did the Chinese print with paper? Currency. The very first paper currency in the world was printed in China during the Yuan dynasty. That's why they call their currency the yuan. So China was technologically superior to Europe. India had teas, dyes, and spices. And so the Europeans wanted to trade. But when Tamerlane conquered Central Asia, when Mehmed II conquered Constantinople in 1453, it ended the land trade routes. And so that's when Columbus sets sail looking for a sea route to get to India and China. Columbus thought he made it to India, so he names the people he meets Indians, the name sticks. Think of it, we never would have called Native Americans Indians if it had not been for Islamic Jihad. Right? Columbus gave the name because he thought he was an Indian. Why was he trying to get to India in 1492? Because in 1453, the Muslims cut off the land route. As the Muslims were invading Greece, they were destroying museums and churches, and so the Greek scholars were fleeing to Florence, Italy. This flood of Greek stuff into Florence is called the Renaissance. And then the Greek scholars flee with their Greek New Testaments, and the European scholars like Erasmus translate the Bible not just to Latin, but to Greek. And this reinterest in the original language of the Bible lays the foundation for the Reformation. So in 1517, Martin Luther starts the Reformation. 1529, 100,000 Muslims surround Vienna under Suleiman the Magnificent. And so Martin Luther says the Turk is the rod of the wrath of the Lord our God. If the Turk's God, the devil, is not beaten first, there's reason to fear the Turk will not be so easy to beat. The fight against the Turks must begin with repentance. We must reform our lives, and we shall fight in vain. Our sins and ingratitude have earned God's wrath and disfavor, so he justly get us into the hands of the devil and the Turk. John Calvin says, I hear the sad condition of your Germany. The Turk again prepares to wage war with a larger force who will stand up to oppose his marching throughout the land at his mere will and pleasure. John Wesley wrote, ever since the religion of Islam appeared in the world, the espousers of it have been as wolves and tigers to all other nations, rending and tearing all that fell into their merciless paws. Remember Thomas Aquinas, he says, Muhammad seduced the people by promises of carnal pleasure. Those who believed in him were brutal men and desert wanderers. Muhammad forced others to become his followers by the violence of his arms. And so Sultan Suleiman controls this whole huge area called the Ottoman Empire. His counterparts, the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor of Spain. He controls Spain, Portugal, Spanish, Netherlands, Italy, the New World. He's taking the gold from the New World to fit out his navy to keep the Muslims from taking over the Mediterranean. And the Philippines are named after his son, King Philip of Spain. And so these are the two most powerful kings in the world. And since he's Catholic, he's faced with a double dilemma. Protestant Reformation on one hand, Muslim invasion on the other. And so Charles V decides to do something unprecedented. He makes a deal with the Protestants. It's called the Peace of Augsburg of 1555. And in it is a little Latin phrase that had a huge repercussion. Cuius regio, ius religio, which means whose is the reign, his is the religion. In other words, look, Protestant king, believe whatever you want in your kingdom. Let's just work together against these Muslims who are invading Europe because they want to kill us all. And so it worked. And it started a domino effect in Europe where different kings believed different things. Northern Germany and Sweden were Lutheran, Switzerland Calvinist, Scotland Presbyterian, Holland Dutch Reformed, Greece was Greek Orthodox, Spain, Portugal, and so forth remained Catholic, Anglican. So, before the Muslim invasion, all of Western Europe was Catholic. After the Muslim invasion, the Peace of Augsburg, the different countries of Europe got to choose different denominations. People began to migrate from one country to another. They spilled over and founded colonies in America. Anyway, the Muslim pirate admirals were in Greece, dominated the Mediterranean. Andrea Doria was the best the Italians could do to put up a fight. Muslims wanted Malta. They controlled North Africa, all the Middle East, into Greece. They want this little island so they can get Sicily and Europe, but they're defeated at the siege of Malta, September 11, 1565. This was the first major slapdown for the Muslim Navy. And then they have 230 ships, and they're defeated at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. Great story, but I don't have time to get into it. And then in 1683, same year, William Penn is founding Pennsylvania. 200,000 Muslims surround Vienna. And they're defeated on September 11, 1683. And Jan Sobieski, the Polish king, leads the largest cavalry charge in history up to this date, 40,000 Polish horses. The Polish soldiers had made wings for their back, and it made this enormous whistling noise. Anyway, Jan Sobieski was considered the savior of Western civilization, and he goes into the abandoned Muslim tents and finds these bags of beans, coffee beans, realizes this was this new Muslim drink that allowed him to fight day and night. And shortly thereafter, this Polish general, George Franz Kosciuszko, opens the first Vienna coffee house. Now, they weren't sure if they should drink coffee because it was, after all, the Muslims drink. So they took a cup of it to Pope Clement. He tasted it, said, this is too good to leave for the Muslims, let's baptize it. And then coffee spread across Europe. Now, the word coffee comes from the Arabic word kafir, which means infidel. Because the beans came from Ethiopia, which was one of the few African countries able to stay Christian. It was Abyssinia, remember Queen of Sheba was from there? And so the Muslims called the Christians in Ethiopia kafirs, or infidels. And since the bean came from there, they called it the kafir bean, or as we say today, the coffee bean. So have you had your cup of infidel today? No. But it's okay to drink, Pope Clement said so. Well, the Muslims were tunneling under the walls of Vienna. They were going to set explosives and blow up the wall. And so the bakers were up early. They heard the noise, told the soldiers, put down buckets of water. They saw the ripples. They intercepted the tunnel. After the victory, they were going to reward the baker. He said, I don't need a reward. Just give me the sole permission to cook a pastry in the shape of the Muslim crescent. And it was called the croissant. So the next time you have coffee and croissants, you can celebrate the victory of the Battle of Vienna, September 11, 1683. This was the beginning of the end of the Ottoman Empire that finally was defeated after World War I. Well, there's a whole lot more, but I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Scott. And hope you enjoyed. Did you get something out of this tonight?